The Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Keeping the Faith with your host, Senior Fellow Joe Wolcott.
Psalm 20. Trust in the name of the Lord our God. To the choir master, a psalm of David. May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and give you support from Zion. May he remember all your offerings and regard with favor your burnt sacrifices. Selah. May he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill all your plans. May we shout for joy over your salvation, and in the name of our God set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all your petitions. Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving might of his right hand. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. They collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. O Lord, save the king. May he answer us when we call. Welcome back to Keeping the Faith. I am your host, Joseph Wolcott, and today we have an extremely important topic to discuss. How we educate our children decides our nation's future. Today's students are tomorrow's workers and leaders. Like with many things, there is a distinctly Christian way to go about this. In fact, there's a rich history and philosophy of classical Christian education. Here to help me talk about that is Dr. Jason Edwards. Dr. Edwards received his MA in history and his PhD in the history and philosophy of education from the University of Kentucky. Dr. Edwards is a professor of history at Grove City College and a fellow for popular culture with the Institute for Faith and Freedom. A former Lerman Scholar and Salvatore Fellow with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, Edwards' research interests center on agrarian philosophy and the history of learning in Western civilization. He co-authored the book, Ask the Professor, What Freshmen Need to Know, and has published writings on history, culture, and education in a variety of newspapers and journals, including the Washington Times, University Bookman, and Touchstone. He's coached Grove City College individuals and teams to 36 national champions in the collegiate debate. Dr. Edwards, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on. So you're a history professor. I've had several classes with you at this point. But one thing that gets talked about among the students a bunch is your Foundations of Education course. So I guess before we get really into the meat of the topic, how did you get interested in this field of study?
Well, since you have taken a number of my classes, I think things are causal. Mm-hmm. So there's a number of reasons, but Probably my first interest in history generally is just I was trying to impress my grandfather, who was a history buff. And then I continue to be attracted to history because of its breadth, actually, which is a little bit challenging sometimes because higher education for a long time now emphasizes specialization, and I've always been attracted to the breadth of it. And that has led me as well, I suppose, to education. So I sometimes give a plug for history that it kind of swallows up the other disciplines because there's a history of biology, there's a history of literature, there's a history of theology, but maybe in a sense education even swallows up history, that this is a way to really look at all of the disciplines. And I also would say I just have always been I realize I've always been interested in education, but specifically education and teaching done well. So I even look back particularly at my high school years, and I admit up front I didn't go about this the right way, but I really did intentionally make life very hard on student teachers in particular who I didn't think really were necessarily cut out for the field and wouldn't do a good job. And so even looking back in negative ways, ways I didn't handle it right, I do think even that was reflecting a real sense of calling that I have that I'd like to help prepare the next generations of great teachers and help out students as widely as I can.
Yeah, awesome. So let's get right into it then. So What, in short, is the history of classical Christian education? Because that's kind of a particular angle that we're, going to focus on here.
Right. So, to the honest degree, that would to explain that question, which is a good one, would require doing all of Western civilization, which it's my understanding we don't have quite that much time available to us today. But what most people are talking about today with classical Christian education, and it's become the largest really movement in private education in the country and really the world now, harkens back to a essay written in the late 40s by Dorothy Sayers called The Lost Tools of Learning. And William F. Buckley, as the story goes, kind of would periodically, didn't think he had the time to really run with it, but periodically would publish that, hoping that somebody might really run with what she was saying about these lost tools of learning. And sure enough, in 1991, Douglas Wilson came out with a book called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, and he had designed his own school and educational program in Moscow, Idaho, for his children, and had expanded on this. And that book really launched the movement in how people think about classical Christian education today, and what they are, what they're referencing with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what would be some of the basic principles of this model of education that sets it apart from other forms?
Right. Well, I think, again, with this kind of contemporary understanding of it, they really emphasize the trivium. Now, that's a old term that goes to medieval, and they would arguably say, Dorothy Sayers more indicated that, well, this is a medieval system of education. But in modern parlance, if you're going to say, well, I want to get medieval on your child, that's not going to sell very well. So they probably did a good marketing move to say, well, let's more call this classical. So how much it's always reflecting classical, it can be debated. But this idea of the trivium, and so specifically grammar, logic, and rhetoric, is something that they have centered this system of education around. And they look at it in terms of that those subjects themselves are very important. So if you went to a classical school, you'd have grammar class, you'd have logic class, you'd have rhetoric class. But they also interpret it two other ways. They look at it as an effective formula for learning any subject. So let's say we want to learn biology. They would say, well, there's a grammar of biology, so there's these basic terms and facts that you need to memorize, that you need to master before you can go to the logic dialectic kind of phase where you can understand how these facts interact with one another, and then ultimately you're trying to get to a rhetorical phase where
to communicate the facts.
There you go, so that you can communicate your facts. Maybe the first level is knowledge, then it's understanding, and then it's wisdom, that you can convey these truths, the understanding that you've developed to other people, which really gives you a mastery of it at another level. So they like it for the subjects, they like it as a method to master, to learn any subject, and then they like it as well as kind of a shorthand to understand child or human development, that they would say, and we used to call our elementary schools, grammar schools. And so they'd say, well, these kids, and they're kind of fun because they would say, well, look, little kids can memorize better than you and I can. And what's really bizarre is they like it, so they'll memorize something and A, B, C, D, and they want to tell you that. And it's like, hey, I got it, and so forth. And then
I went through private Christian schooling, and I still remember some of the old chants they had us do. I could rattle off our entire, the one that always comes to mind is the Alamo chant. I could rattle off all the facts of the Alamo because they had us run through that song so many times.
So they like that as that grammar, that take advantage. This is a time where, especially if you put it to song or make a chant of it, that they're going to memorize these facts like never before, never again. And then they would say, like, roughly junior high, what are those kids like? Well, they like to argue. They like to, really look at the nuance or catch little things that you've said. So they say, okay, well, let's lean in. There's the logic phase. Let's lean into that. Let's work with the grain. And then what do high schoolers like? They like to express themselves. And so they'd say, all right, let's express ourselves well through writing, through the orally, musically, and so forth. And hey, we've made sure that you know something. We've tried to make sure that you understand it, and so you probably at this point have something valuable to express. And so that's how they approach it. So I would say that's the classical component of how contemporary classical folks have oriented that. And then, but I hasten to add that it's that what you've asked me about and what they're focused on is classical Christian. And so with they're trying to incorporate Christianity into all of the subjects and into their approach. And a big attractiveness of classical Christian is the Christian, that they, increasing number of parents reasonably conclude or have experienced. It's like, well, wait a minute, the schools seem to really be undermining and running counter to our deeply held sense of faith, and I don't want my kids to have to battle that. I'd rather have my faith be reinforced in the classroom, and so that Christian component is crucial as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that I came across, because I talked to some students that have taken your Found Ed class to kind of get ideas on where to take this, and one of the things that kept on coming up was this idea of developing an education philosophy. So could you unpack for me what you get at with education philosophy in the classroom, and how does one form a good, consistent education philosophy?
Sure. No, thank you for the question. So I think what they probably are referencing right out of one of the first things we read is, and I'm borrowing a lot from a philosopher, Michael Peterson, but several folks point out, and I am sympathetic to this argument, is that in education, we frequently are taught, if you talk to education, to people about education, it won't take very long before people start referencing best method. And well, of course we want to use best method and so forth. I have never heard anybody say, well, I'm for mediocre or poor method. But I fear that best method is frequently ending a discussion or ending a reflection when really it should be starting. So if you're going to say best method, I'm going to more respond, well, best for what? And who came up with this method? And what were they trying to accomplish with this method? I don't want any educator to just adopt best method just because they and just assume that and not know, well, where did this come from? Where did this, who originated it? And what really were they after? So what I would advocate for, again, kind of echoing Michael Peterson, his argument would be really if we want progress in education, we need to be starting at philosophy, worldview, and then really understand that, and then have that inform our educational philosophy, which then would inform our educational policy, and then only then do we get to and informs our educational practice. And so you ask about being consistent. I think we can be consistent at that philosophical level, really understand who am I dealing with, what am I trying to do here, what are our values. It's much harder to be consistent at the practical level because I do think there's lots of best methods. Like it depends what I might advocate. If you tell me I have a class, say of 5 students, and what I might recommend that you do would be very different if you're telling me, well, you have a class of 25 or 50 or 100. If you ask me, well, what method should I use if I'm teaching a practical thing? Well, I might tell you something very different than if you say, well, I want you to teach philosophy or history or theology. So I think there's a lot of variety, and we have to be careful just at this level of, well, best practice. Whatever's labeled as best practice probably may well be the best practice in a particular situation, but not in all situations. So I want people to start with that
So
philosophy.
maybe it's not that you want to find a consistent philosophy per se, but that you want to ingrain certain principles that can be adapted to different situations.
Yeah.
If I'm understanding you correctly.
I think you're understanding me pretty closely there. I think you can be accurate, that you can be consistent philosophically, but down at the practice level, I think there's a wide variety of ways of how you're going to apply that. So, and with the philosophy, I think that I would encourage folks in the class is trying to wrestle with, well, what does Christianity have to say about, education? So if I believe, that that we all share a sinful human nature, well, that's going to lead me to a different educational conclusions. If I think that there's no sin, it's just ignorance, well, that leads me to a different educational programs and thinking and so forth.
So I guess let's kind of hammer out what some of those principles are, because obviously you have different theological systems where if you get into the nitty gritty, there will be different outflowings of that. But let's try and establish sort of like a mere Christianity here of education foundations. Like what would you say are sort of the core things that every Christian can affirm that should form the core of that philosophy? Right.
Well, there's a number of them. I might start with, especially thinking of as far as contrasting with modernity, it makes a big difference if you believe that we're living in and that we are created beings by God, as opposed to that we're just a big accident that's happened and so forth. One I guess I've alluded to already. If you think that the truth exists, that truth doesn't change, that it's eternal. Similarly, goodness and beauty. These are actual things that were, if it was true for the Greeks, it's true for me. If it's true for the Romans, it's true for you. That's a very different approach than, well, everything is evolving, everything is changing. That might have been fine for them, but that's different for us and so forth. So again, a big one for me is that, well, sin exists. That sin is a real thing. So it's not merely ignorance that we're dealing with. That we really are attracted and have a sinful human nature. That's going to make a difference on how you approach education. That the individual has really infinite value and worth, and so we're both appreciate the individual and we're sympathetic to their suffering and how they're wrestling with life and so forth. I think those are all crucial components that all Christians would affirm, and when we seek to consistently, as you were asking, apply those philosophically, that is going to start to have some ramifications on the classroom and what we teach and how we might go about teaching and so forth.
Yeah. I guess as with any topic, the question then is, what are ways that you have seen this go wrong in the past? Like, what are things that we as people approaching this topic need to be cognizant of, that we don't go too far in certain directions? Like, just
for classical
Christian education, like how are ways you have seen or can see it get botched that you would warn our audience against?
Yes. Well, we can always figure out how to botch things.
It's true.
For sure. That might be one of our principles as well that we could agree on. So I guess with that, I do think I'd go right to arguably the number one deadly sin of pride. So this is I guess if you see something and you accurately or even inaccurately see like, well, I don't think this system is doing well. I don't think that this is being done right. And you come in and fix it, and you make some progress with that and have some good results. You got to always be careful that pride doesn't start slipping in and leading you astray with it. And I guess when I talked about the classical folks tend to look at this formula for and level in a sense of learning that, okay, well, I'm getting the basic knowledge, and then I'm going to go to understanding, and then I'm going to go to rhetoric. There's a danger of sometimes of graduates of classical schools sometimes seem to think it might be a pride thing, but also related to that is they kind of think they've arrived, and it's like, well, wait a minute, I'm at the rhetoric level, and so
like, what more is there to learn? What
more is there to learn? Or their professor comes and says, hey, you got to learn these basic facts, and it's like, oh, I don't, I'm kind of past that now. It's like, no, in classical education would be saying, no, you have to anything you've always got to go through these stages. But if
we're being truly classical, we'd take the Socratic approach of the wise man is the one who knows how much he doesn't know.
There you go. But that's rare, and Socrates even warned, or Plato through him, that maybe we're not going to hit that till we're 30, and so forth. So so it takes a maturity that sometimes doesn't happen, or that's certainly something that's a danger. I did emphasize, the Trivium, which is very language based. Now the true classical folks would be saying, now Dr. Ed, why didn't you mention the quadrivium? And the liberal arts are really, it's the trivium and the quadrivium, and so with the quadrivium, you're getting a heavy emphasis, obviously, on math and science generally, and they are trying to do that. But the fact of the matter is that they probably
skews a little
have
more in favor of the trivium.
It definitely seems to attract trivium folks, or language, literature, history. Those folks really thrive in people who really love those subjects tend to really thrive in a classical Christian or classical education world, and folks who lean and have interest more focused on science and math might sometimes feel a little bit like they've gotten a short shrift in the system. It's not inherent in the system, but people are concerned about that, and sometimes reasonably so. You have to be careful.
What are ways to approach the trivium folks and the quadrivium folks and try and find a way to bridge the gap between those two that you've come across? Right.
Well, I mean, I think classical education done well is inherently trying to do that, and they are saying, look, it is the 7 liberal arts. And so they really are trying to do a good job with both of those things.
Which I guess we should clarify for our audience, because we did say what the 3 parts of the trivium were. What are the 4 studies of the quadrivium?
Arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Are the 4. So
sorry, continue. I just wanted to make sure we made that clear to the audience.
No,
so we didn't leave them in the dark.
I appreciate that. And you can. So if you know arithmetic and geometry obviously are math heavy. I once saw a funny cartoon, or I thought it was funny that it's a class. It said Astronomy 101, and the class is packed. And then the first day, one of the students is waving and asks, "What's the difference between astronomy and astrology?" And the person said, "Lots and lots of math." And woof, the place cleared out. But if you know about astronomy, this is very math based. And then the one that surprises sometimes people, but not musicians, is the music is very mathematical, of course, as well. And so it's really embracing the math. Some would argue that the music would actually include the muses. And so, Cleo is my favorite, the muse of history. So in some ways, you could expand that out to cover some other subjects as well. But they're trying to give you, the liberal arts are ultimately trying to liberate you to truth and liberate you from ignorance. And particularly in a Christian context, you need Christ to liberate you from sin, but they're trying to embrace that and looking at truth, goodness, and beauty, looking at an understanding that God has created these things and the world, particularly for folks who are doing classical Christian education, I think is how you very easily blend those things and don't become in a silo that just is interested in one facet of God's creation, but is really appreciative of the entirety of God's creation.
Yeah. Okay, so moving from that to some of the practical applications in the classroom, because one of the things that really piqued my interest in your class in particular and just the topic is several of my friends, when they were in your class, I'd see them like, oh yeah, we're going to the gym with a bunch of friends for our education class, or we're dressing fancy for our education class. So I guess talk a little bit about some of the ways that you help students develop in these things we've been talking about in the classroom, some of that practical stuff.
Okay, well, let me clarify a little bit here.
Okay.
We have been talking, your questions before would emphasize or brought to attention my class on the historical and philosophical foundations of education. And that class is a requirement now for people who are getting the Grove City College offers a minor in classical Christian education. But I want to be clear that on the foundations of education class, that class is not advocating classical Christian education specifically. We're looking at the history and philosophy of education, and I really am emphasizing in there, here are these various philosophies, here's how they've played out in history. It's your job. I want you to be an informed citizen. I want you to be an informed parent, and you need to wrestle and come up with your own conclusions about that.
Gotcha.
The class that you're now referencing, of seeing me make students do some funny things, we do have a seminar on specifically classical Christian education.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And
okay, so that was kind of mentally meshing
yeah,
the two together.
which is fine, but I just wanted to be clear that we do have I do also teach a class that is straight away saying, okay, these folks would like to get a job in classical Christian education, and so we go through specific books, and on that you're getting more specific instruction on, well, here's how to do it. And classical Christian education, I would say too, I usually make in that class make a plug that it really is an exciting field, because whereas education or schooling in the United States, and particularly public schooling in the United States, really decided what they wanted to do at the beginning of the 20th century and have stayed pretty consistent, and are just kind of doing the same thing. Here's our formula for better or worse. This is what we want you to do. The classical Christian and private school folks are actually, maybe ironically, more open to experimentation than most avenues of school. So I try to embrace that myself and experiment a little bit with it. So we talk about, and I just want the students to be cognizant of, do you see this as impactful? So most classical Christian schools have uniforms. So we wrestle with, well, what's the uniform supposed to do, and why would they have it? And so I give them a uniform. So it's like, okay, well, you're going to dress up for a week or two and go to pay attention to how other students treat you. How does do they treat you any different? Does the faculty treat you any different? Do you feel any different by being dressed up and ready for action? Another field of this, a lot of this would be I would come at it from a Neil Postman angle, that the medium can be the message type of thing. Others might come at it from, like James K.A. Smith has talked about sacramental learning, that the way that you act physically can have a big impact on you intellectually, spiritually. And so for a lot of them, I make them, okay, well, I think a missed opportunity in a lot of education is the cafeteria. That the cafeteria can teach us things, meals, food and feasting, as Dr. Mitchell would appreciate.
I'm in that right now.
There you go. So you can teach me some, but I'm trying to have them wrestle with, okay, what if we all eat breakfast together and start the day that way? What if we all eat lunch together? What if we all eat dinner together? How does that develop our community? And the idea of community is crucial, I think, to classical Christian education. So I just have them do a lot of unusual activities, and it does definitely seem to impact them. One of my favorite lines I've ever heard one of them say is like, "Well, Dr. Edwards, you created a monster," and so they really get united and have a different experience. But I'm trying to have them, hey, you're gonna go to one of these classical Christian schools. They're pretty open to wrestling with how should our cafeteria operate and look, and should we be doing certain things there? What should our dress code be, or should we have uniforms? What would that be like? Again, as a couple of examples. So that's what I'm trying to have them have a little different experience with it, so they have a direct experience of, oh, you know what, that I did kind of think that made a difference, and get a perspective that way.
Yeah. So I guess just to bring things to a close here, where should parents who are thinking about sending their students to to classical Christian school, or students that are thinking of going in or sending their future children into classical Christian school, where should they start with implementing these models that we've talked about into their lives?
Right. So
just like laying the foundation for that.
Sure. So fairly obviously, I'm going to say, well, let's read up on it, type of thing. So that can be, a little frustrating maybe, because I don't have the book to say, I don't have one to sell, and I don't have one to sell on behalf of someone else that says, well, here's the book. So a lot of people, it definitely has some limitations. It's definitely gotten limited, but I mean, I have to say, the Douglas Wilson Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning has proven itself to be very powerful for an awful lot of folks. And if you were ever to go to one of these schools trying to get a job as a parent, as a student, you're not going to be there too long before someone says, hey, have you read Douglas Wilson's Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning? So I guess I would say that one's worth checking out. I believe it was last year, or at most 2 years ago, there was a book that became a bestseller by Peter Hegseth called The Battle for the American Mind. I believe is the correct title. I think it was a bestseller. It does have some strengths. I am suspicious. I think he really was maybe attempting to replace the Wilson book as the dominant book, and I have my class, have had a couple classes read it, but they haven't been
not as impressed as with Wilson's.
Yeah, well, I mean, both authors. There's Douglas Wilson. I don't think I have to tell you is a controversial. He draws strong reactions from people for a variety of reasons. So his has some limitations, but they didn't see this book as a replacement necessarily for that. I guess the best one that I know of, unfortunately, I think it might be out of print now, but by Andrew Kern. It's just called Classical Education, the Movement Sweeping America. And Gene Edward Veith, I believe, also co-authored that with him. And that one really looks at, it explains classical Christian education, and it also looks at all of these different organizations, these various schools that have different tweaks and angles and so forth on it. So I think that is maybe for me the best place to start to get an understanding of this. But ultimately for me, I think just the key thing, and I would say, want to say, especially clearly that the key. I don't know that, I'm not here to say that classical or what labels classical is best and all. I would kind of rely back on what I said, that it depends. But I do think Christianity is true and is eternally so, and what is the essential thing. And so I really do want to encourage people to embrace their faith and realize. I like to reference in Found Ed, we read Tacitus, so the great Roman historian, and Tacitus can be kind of a curmudgeonly character. So naturally, I would feel affinity with him. And Tacitus, looking at the Roman Republic, moving from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, and lamenting that change, says, what we did wrong was that in the Roman Republic, we took care of our own children and we had them raised by Romans, and then we conquered the Greeks, and we started to turn over our children to Greek slaves to be taught. And what did the Greek slaves do? They gave us back Greeks. They didn't give us back Romans. And so that's really the metaphor that I like to encourage people to remember and would go forth with is, make sure that, be careful who you turn your children over to. And if you're Roman, make sure that you insist on Roman teachers, insist on Roman curriculum. And even if it's labeled best practice, if it's Greek, don't be surprised if they give you back a Greek rather than a Roman. So whatever that might mean to someone, that's what I encourage them to wrestle with is make sure if you want to maintain Romanness, then be careful of who. Make sure your teachers and your curriculums are Roman.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
All right.
If you don't mind, I'll just wrap up our episode with
this
episode's reading from the Heidelberg Catechism.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you again, Joseph, for having me.
Yeah. So, Lord's Day 20, question 53. What do you believe concerning the Holy Spirit? Answer. First, he is, together with the Father and the Son, true and eternal God. Second, he is also given to me, to make me by true faith share in Christ and all his benefits, to comfort me and to remain with me forever. Dr. Edwards, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Keeping the Faith. I am your host, Joseph Wolcott, and I will see you in the next episode.